Hi everyone, welcome back to Creed 26 Ministries' investigation of the basics of Islam, Islam 101. In this video we're going to take a look at the life of Muhammad. Now there are three main sources we can use to learn about Muhammad's life. The first is the Quran, the second are the Sirah, and the third are Hadith. Now I want to make it very clear, the Quran is not a biography on Muhammad, not even close. But it is the earliest source we have when it comes to Muhammad's life. It tells us the kinds of things that he taught, for example. Muhammad exhorted his followers to believe in monotheism, that he told them to strive in the cause of Allah, be that to give of their money and time for widows and orphans, or be it to fight on the battlefield. We can see the kinds of things he told his followers to recite, for example, the last 3 chapters of the Quran. So we can learn a lot about Muhammad from the Quran. It should not be neglected. But when it comes to the details on Muhammad's life, the Hadith and the Sirah are probably better sources. Now the problem with these sources is they are much later than the Quran. The Sirah, the earliest one that we have, is Ibn Ishaq. It's been redacted, and it's no earlier than 150 years after Muhammad's life. Similarly, the Hadith, you have some Hadith that come within 2 centuries after Muhammad, but the most authentic Hadith come from 250 years later, those of Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim. So, in order to learn about Muhammad, we really have to turn to sources that come way after his death. What we find when we turn to these sources is very interesting. For example, we find that the Meccans generally revered Muhammad even before he was a prophet. We see that he was considered to be a Sadiq, the truthful. He was turned to in order to resolve the conflicts of certain Meccan tribes. We can also see the details of Muhammad receiving his first revelation. For example, when he received the revelation, he was pressed extremely hard, according to Sahih Bukhari. According to Ibn Ishaq, he thought he was going to die by a spiritual force that was pressing on him, commanding him to recite. When he finally recited, he left the cave and he thought he was possessed either by a demon or a poet, and his wife convinced him that he in fact was not. Again, from Sahih Bukhari, we can learn that Muhammad was very, very depressed, even suicidal, considering jumping off of mountaintops in the early part of his prophethood. And so the Hadith don't just record things that might look positive, they also record some things that we would consider negative about Muhammad. And in that sense, they have degrees of accuracy that modern critical historians would consider reliable. But there's much more that's found in the Hadith as well. The vast majority of the Hadith refers to how Muhammad lived his life as a prophet, the things he commanded, how he interpreted verses of the Quran, the way we're supposed to live according to little details of Sharia. These are the kinds of things we will find in the Hadith literature about Muhammad. Of these details, we find a trend. In the first part of Muhammad's prophethood, that when he was in Mecca, he was appealing to the monotheists, the Christians and the Jews, and he was really exhorting a peaceful message of social reform. Take care of the widows, take care of the orphans. This is probably because Muhammad himself had been an orphan at a very young age. He had been moved from home to home. His father died before he was born. His mother died when he was just 6 years old. He moved to his grandfather's house. He died when he was just 8 years old, and so he moved to his uncle's house. And so Muhammad lived as an orphan under the care of a widow to begin with. And so early on in Islamic history, we find Muhammad exhorting social welfare, social reform, monotheism, very, very good things, even cohesion between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Now we see a shift that happens after Muhammad goes to Medina. This was a city that welcomed him in after the persecution of some of the Meccans who were around him. Now he moved under conditions of duress. He was being persecuted. And here in Medina we find Muhammad begin to engage in battles against the Meccans who had persecuted him. The Hadith and Sirah literature are very clear in how these battles started. This isn't the place to get into that discussion, but you can learn about these things from the Sirah and the Hadith. Throughout the Meccan phase of Muhammad's prophethood, we see a focus on administration, we see a focus on laws, and we see a focus on battles. This is because of the situations in which Muhammad lived at these times. Finally, he comes back to Mecca with 10,000 soldiers, conquers it, and he lives the last few years of his life there. The Hadith and the Sirah do certainly show characteristics of Muhammad that we can learn about. For example, Muslims rightly point to the fact that when Muhammad came back to Mecca in order to conquer it, he granted virtually everyone amnesty. Now, not absolutely everyone, but virtually everyone. And he was far more merciful in that scenario than most people probably would have been. But the Sirah and the Hadith also share information that can be quite disturbing. For example, we see according to Sirah that Muhammad single-handedly commissioned the beheading of somewhere between 500 to 800 Jews in one day. We also see him ordering assassinations of old men and women who are breastfeeding their children. So, to understand Muhammad, both the good and the bad, my suggestion is to read the primary sources yourself. Read Ibn Ishaq, read Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, get an understanding of who Muhammad is. Now you'll often find that when you read the primary sources, you'll come away with something quite different from what modern Muslims believe. Now I would say by far the most important thing we can discuss in this video is what Muslims believe about Muhammad. And that is that he is the most perfect man who ever walked the earth. He was great in courage, in generosity, in kindness, in love, in forgiveness, that his exemplary qualities cannot be surpassed by any human ever. If you turn to some secondary sources, in other words, books that people have written today about Muhammad's life, you will see the kinds of things that Muslims are often told about Muhammad. My exhortation to you is to compare those things to the primary sources themselves. See for yourself, according to Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim and Ibn Ishaq, who Muhammad was. Learn about his life from the early sources, not from things that people are telling you to believe today. When you read those sources, I'm convinced you will have a much better understanding of who Muhammad was. And in order to understand Islam truly, you have to understand Muhammad and his central role. As always, there's so much more I wish I could say, but this is just an introduction into the basics of Islam. So now that you've been introduced to Muhammad, I hope that you learn more about him in an effort to understand your Muslim friends and neighbors. Thank you so much for watching this video. I pray that you'll come back often to creed26.com to learn more about the origins of Islam and Christianity. God bless you all.